All right, so today we're going to conclude our series talking about habits. We just took a little 3-week look at these habits as we talked about a new year, new possibilities. We began with, and we're going to re-emphasize this once again, is that we began with the idea that we need to start with who we want to become. Who is God trying to lead us into? And then we said, what do we need to start in order to get there? Today we're going to talk about what we need to stop in order to get there. So, I believe that no one starts off in their life by saying, you know what my goal is? I really want to be one of those people who struggle financially and stress over money. That's my goal. No one plans to say, you know what, I really just want to become so physically unfit that I can't move anymore. Nobody starts off in life and say, you know what I'm shooting for? Wonderful addictions to all kinds of substances. You know what I'm shooting for? To live a life with no passion, with no drive, and no vision. No one believes that's the ultimate goal of their life. No one plans in the beginning of it to be able to say, that's what I'm shooting for. And as we've talked about the last couple of weeks, we rarely end up in that place because of one bad decision. It's usually one step at a time, one day at a time, one habit at a time. So we're going to start today learning and talking about one guy. His name is Samson. Now, Samson is found in the book of Judges. In the book of Judges, you'll find a number of judges, and here's the exact number. The main judges that we look at in the book of Judges is 6. Now, you'd say, well, why does that matter? Well, here's the reason why. 6 is incomplete. 6 is imperfect. And as you'll find, one of the judges that's meant to come and lead the people, who's meant to come and be able to say, this is the direction that we're supposed to go as a nation, is also corrupted. So, Judges chapter 16, verse 1, we find this little verse. And it says, one day Samson went to the Philistine town of Gaza and spent the night with a prostitute. It's funny, one day he decided that, guess what? I'm going to take this walk 25 miles into enemy territory because I really need to. I was interested to find out how long, because if you remember, there's no travel that was like a fast train, to get from Jerusalem to Gaza. There was about 25 miles, and he said, so guess what? He was going to have to use his feet. And how many steps is that for 25 miles? It's approximately 56,250 steps. This is how long he was even able to say, guess where I'm going? I'm going to find a prostitute. I'm going to take 50,000 steps in order to get to a place that actually might kill me. Because here, remember, the Philistines and the Israelites, they didn't like each other. They hated each other. They were enemies. And he was going into enemy territory in order to get himself into trouble. This actually leads us to understand this life of Samson, the life of Samson that would lead down this spiraling path out of control, where we find that women was a real issue for Samson. He couldn't quit any of it. And we ultimately see, as we know Samson most for the companion name, Samson and who? Delilah. Delilah was a beauty. He was attracted, but she was looking for evil. You see, there's the part, right? Is that Samson didn't think, hey, these 56,250 steps are going to lead to getting my life spiraling out of control. Samson didn't say, oh, this decision is ultimately going to lead me to a place that I never want to go, leading ultimately to his death. Samson didn't believe it, and I believe neither do we when we look at those small steps in our life, the small things that we start to incorporate, and the things that we start to incorporate, and even the people that we start to incorporate into our lives. And when we start to say, like, oh, well, this small thing, it doesn't matter. It's not going to lead anywhere that bad. And then it leads us to as we call it, the slippery slope. It leads us to say, well, if this was okay, then also I can take on the next thing, and this is okay. And if this is okay, then I'm just going to take it all in. I'm going to make sure that I embrace every good thing that makes my flesh sing. And so today, as we talk about, when we're looking at that focus, we want to look at who we want to become. And the focus today is, as we're still shooting for who we want to become, we ask the who questions. Who is it that I want to become? Not the do goals, remember? The do goals say, this is the things I need to put in place. I want to read more. I want to pray more. I want to do this more. I want to do this less. The do goals are always going to fall short. But when we are looking at who we want to become, it leads us to a bigger picture. So based on that, who we want to become, what's one habit that we need to break today? James will help frame this for us today. James chapter 1, verse 21. So get rid of all the filth and the evil in your lives, and humbly accept the word God has planted in your hearts, for it has the power to save your souls. So if we're looking at trying to get rid of, and we're not just talking about all habits, we're talking about the bad habits. If we're trying to get rid of the bad habits, it's the filth that we need to get rid of, because it's starting to choke out the life that God is trying to put into us. See, God is trying to implant life into us, while yet the evil one tries to sow the seeds of fear, of doubt, and gets us off track. So here's the problem. Good habits start very difficult, and the payoff is usually in the future. Let me give you an example. If you're saying, so I'm going to get more healthy, meaning I'm going to go to the gym, or I'm going to run outside, right? And I started this a couple of years ago, and I started running outside, and it was cold. And you're like, who wants to get up early and go outside and run when it's freezing? You see, the difficult part comes up front. And you're like, if I can just press through this, there's going to be an eventual payoff. That's where it's going to lead us to. But here's the problem, right? Because the bad habits actually have an immediate perceived benefit right up front. If you're like, I love chocolate, I love sweets, I'm going to eat them right now. And when you eat them, you're like, this tastes so good, right? The perceived benefit is like, this is what I enjoy. My body was craving it, and now I've fulfilled it. There's an immediate perceived benefit. But guess what? This leads to a much more negative results later on. This leads us in the path of saying, you know what, this little piece, it doesn't hurt that much. I can eat a little bit of chocolate here. I can have a little bit of sweets here, a little bit of junk food here. But then it leads me to say, you know what, like I loved it and I enjoyed it so much last time. I'm just going to repeat that over and over and over again. Until it leads us to say, where did all these extra 25 pounds come from? It was just one piece of chocolate, one sweets that I ended up, every day of the week. You see, those bad habits are the ones that are really easier to take on because they have immediate impact. And so today we're going to talk about trying to break those bad habits. How do we break bad habits? Well, the first thing we need to do is acknowledge it. We need to acknowledge that it's a bad habit because you can't defeat what you can't define. Right? So if you're looking at this and you're saying, you know what, like this piece, right, this me eating all kinds of junk food or whatever it is that I'm incorporating into my life, this is what I'm trying to be able to defeat. Because then you're looking at it more often. You're seeing it. It's in front of you. You're identifying it. You've already said in your head, like, this is a bad habit. This is not something I want to continue. So it's a first step on any kind of admission is you're saying it exists. It's important for us to be able to acknowledge it. Because the more that we try to hide it, the more we try to be able to push it off into the recesses of our memory. And the more that we, then our conscience isn't even hitting it anymore. Because then we're going to just ignore our conscience. We're going to ignore everything that's in us that's saying, don't do this. It's not good for you. And eventually we chase that out. The second thing here, we need to also make it difficult. Because we only have so much willpower. So think about it in this sense, like, somebody brought donuts home, and you're like, all right, so if you're not a donut person, maybe this doesn't harm you, but I love donuts. Right, so this would be a very big thing for me. Like if you brought donuts and it's sitting there, maybe the first time I can go buy it and say, you know what, like I don't need any donuts right now, I'm good. Like I'm trying to stay away from the donuts and the consumption of them. It's really easy for me to just dismiss it. But guess what? It sits on the counter. The second time you come around, you're like, oh, those donuts, they're still there. They're staring at me. Even the donuts have eyes. And it's starting to look into my soul. And I'm like, you know what? I catch you there, donut. You're trying to be able to have me consume you. I'm not going to do it. And so you walk away. The third time you're coming around and it's like you're looking at the donut. You're like, this donut, nobody else is eating it. If nobody else is consuming this thing, then it's going to just get bad. And you know what? I really don't want donuts to go bad. Every donut deserves to be eaten. You see how the willpower starts to break down in our lives? It's really easy to be able to say, yeah, I can cut this out once, and I can cut this out when it's like not sitting in front of me constantly. So what is the way in which you're trying to make it difficult? You're going to say, I would rather it not be in front of me. So if somebody brings home donuts, can you bring them with you? Or give them away before you come into the house. So it's going to make it a lot harder for us to be able to look at the donut and see the way in which the donut is trying to get us to consume it. We're going to figure out all the ways in which we're going to say, how can I make it as difficult as possible not to be tempted? All right. Proverbs 4. Let's jump over to Proverbs 4. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 14. Don't do as the wicked do. Don't follow the path of evildoers. Don't even think about it. Don't go that way. Turn away and keep moving. Right? So there is the difficulty, right? So we're making it more difficult. We're saying, I don't want to see it right now. And the more that we put that into our head, the more that we remove it, the more it's easier to walk in the way that we would really want to go. So today we're going to bring back in this concept of habit loops. And so what we have are triggers, action, and reward. And so this is what we want to think about when we're looking at these habit loops. We're going to say we have to remove the trigger and then interrupt the action. So 5 major triggers that we're going to talk about. The 5 major triggers are usually place, like home, school, work, the things that are in our natural path. And we're trying to find, so sometimes when you think about these habit loops, you'd say every time I get home after work, this is what I always do. I take off my shoes. And maybe it's always the habit that then gets stuck in your head and you're saying, so this is what happens when I come in the door. I take off my shoes. And before long, you don't even think about it. You come in the door, you take off your shoes, it becomes a reaction. That's what a habit is. It's that kind of common thing. So if you start to be able to see where some of the bad habits come from, does it come from that place? You say, every night after dinner, I like to eat something sweet. And then a little bit bigger. And then that didn't really fulfill it, so I need to be able, so is there some place? Is there the couch? Is there the chair? Is there the office? Whatever it might be in your home that often sends you on that trigger that leads to a habit, that leads to that action. Then we have to look at that trigger. The next one is time. And I'm reminded of this from David. David in Kings, as it says that as David took over, and this is the Bathsheba story, and this is where you knew it was going to go wrong, is because it said it was springtime. Springtime was the time when the kings went off to war. And then it says this statement right after, but David stayed home. Right? So David was the king. This was the time and the opportunity that he was supposed to go off to war, but guess what? He stays home instead. What happens in the next part of that king's passage is it says, oh, he was sitting on the rooftop, and there is Bathsheba taking a bath on her rooftop. And he spends a little bit more time staring at her. You see, there's something happens then in this that kind of might trigger a season. When you're looking at winter, right, you'd say there's less sun, there's less vitamin D. And so what do? I spend more time in bed, more time trying to be wrapped up by blankets, more time in order for me to be able to be and feel different things, right, different emotions. And we'll get to mood here in a second. But is there a time and a season that leads you into something that leads you to a bad habit? Sometimes times of year lead us to that. So let's move on to the next one, mood. And mood is a big trigger for many things. Because we can look at then and say, you know what, I am feeling happy, so let me reward myself. I'm feeling depressed. Let me cheer myself up. I'm feeling bored. I need to fill it with something. And you see the times and the opportunities when we are looking at something to fill it, something to be able to match it. And when we're looking at happiness and we're saying, what is it that the best can make me happy? If we're not looking at what God's trying to do in us, what we are trying to become, we're going to fulfill something of the flesh, of the desires within us. We're trying to be able to then escape the mood, escape the feeling, or to reward the feeling. And this can lead us into places that are not good, that are very much unhealthy. Are there moments, which is the next trigger? Are there moments that you'd say after a fight with my spouse, I run to my friends and download it all? I berate them. I belittle them. Is there moments after something, before something, as you're looking at that, as you're trying to be able to focus on something, are you saying those moments actually lead us into bad habits? But we also look at the last trigger, which is people. So many studies have been done about the nature of being around people, about being able and also taking on the habits of the people that we're around. We imitate the habits of the people that we're around. And so this leads us to be able to question and be able to say, who is around me? Because it's not just us believing, all right, well, this definitely will not affect me, because they might believe one way, or they might just say, God has no place in anything. And you're like, well, God's important to me. And you'd say, but eventually you stick around and those habits we will start to be able to incorporate. It's not just a feeling, this is science. Science tells us that this will occur. And as we looked at Proverbs even today, we're saying there's something happens when we surround ourselves with people who are looking to be able to inflict violence, we start to become violent. When we have people who are constantly depressed, guess what? It leads us to depression. People affect us more than we realize, that we can start to take on the habits of the things of people around us. And we can't deny that it happens because it's been studied. And science tells us that it's true. And so this, as God has also been saying from the beginning, right? From Scripture, God tells us, be careful with who you're around, because guess what? It's going to affect you. Those habits of people will affect you. So we're looking at all these triggers. The triggers are the things that are going to lead us into an action. And it's ultimately going to lead us to a reward. So what do we need to do? We have to remove the triggers that then interrupt the action. So if we're looking at the trigger and saying, so there are people that are leading me in a direction of some bad habits that are not going to lead to anywhere good. So what do I need to do? Spend less time. I need to spend less time with people who are trying to incorporate bad habits. And this will then interrupt the action that leads next. Because if you're looking at those moments, those triggers, those places, those whatever it might be, any of those triggers, you're going to say, if it's leading me into an action that's negative and harmful for me, I've got to be able to look at the trigger and be able to remove it, because it'll lead me to make a better action. So why resist temptation tomorrow if I have the power to eliminate it today? Why do I want to be able to say, if there's something that God is looking at me, wanting for me to become, And I'm asking God for help in all temptations, as we do every single week when we pray the Lord's Prayer. God, help me with temptation. We can say, God, maybe as God's trying to be able to tell us today when we're looking at some of the places in our own lives that are bad habits, we're going to say, God might be pointing out something for us right now in order so that we can change it. Do you like the direction your habits are taking you right now? You see, these are the parts that each of us individually have to be able to consider. As I talked about last week, this is a wonderful opportunity for you to also incorporate community, godly people in your life. As you are following Jesus and you're also inviting other people into your life that are also following Jesus, this is a good time for you also to be able to take that inventory, to ask people, do you see a direction in my life that isn't good? And then you have to be willing to be vulnerable, to be open, to say, you know what, I need to be able to hear it. I need to be able to sort through it, ask God about it. And if there is something harmful, I need to ask help to remove it. I learned this little trick. It's if you're trying to be able to consider those things and you're looking at something in your life right now, I always, I've got this advice from people in recovery, is that they call it playing the tape forward. So if you're confused about what this action, something that you might be looking at right now, is you're saying, all right, so if I struggle with alcohol and I'm looking at saying, all right, should I take a drink? Well, play the tape forward. All right, let's fast forward. Let's see what happens in the past. This is what always would happen. I would take one drink, it would lead me to 6. I would have 6 and it'd lead me to 12. And then I'd wake up with a hangover, not thinking clearly. So if you're playing the tape forward, you're already starting to see what will come of it. And this, again, as I always like to be able to point back to, just in the last point as well, is that we're going to go back to our community because we're saying, maybe I don't know what it looks like if this is played forward. You might need somebody else to be able to help you, who might have already walked in that path. And you'd say, so I'm trying to be able to figure out how to play this forward. Is there something that's going to be harmful for me? I want to play it forward. Can you help me out? Have you been through this? Let's play it forward together. But you see, in all these things, I think what happens is we oftentimes just feel weak. We feel like there's no way that we could ever overcome any of these big obstacles like our bad habits. We feel like there's no possible way that there could ever be anything that could move this mountain of bad things that are happening, right? That are leading me to these big bad habits that are going to be life-changing. And you see, this is where we talk about weakness. It's where we start to talk about the ways in which God, when He tells us that it's in our weakness, that's where our strength is. Why? Because it's clinging to Christ, who is strong. God in the flesh. Christ in me is stronger than any wrong desires. And when I am weak, He is strong. That's when we look at our bad habits, when we're looking at all the ways in which we're trying to move forward. And we ultimately, as we conclude this series, as we conclude this message today, we are focusing on who we want to become. We're saying, here's the things that I know I need to start, things that are good for me, things that are healthy for me. I want to start those. But I also, God, know that we need to break some of these things that are already occurring. I need to figure out how to break it. Because once again, as Zechariah prophesies in the Old Testament, don't despise those small things. Those small changes, the small ways in which God is working in you. Don't despise them, but sit with them. Because as we'll walk in this journey, as we will look at who we're trying to become, we're going to look at all of these habits in our life, both good and bad. We're going to say, God, how can I continue to walk into things that are good and to cut out the things that are bad? And even as we struggle time and time again, we'll say, this evidence, as we incorporate the small good things, it actually becomes something that we'll say, this is who I am. This is who God's created me to be. In Jesus' name, amen.